Hi everyone. My name is Stephanie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently in Arcadia, which is where I've lived my whole life. And my home church is a Church of the Good Shepherd in Arcadia, where Pastor George was. And as of right now, since we're online, that's pretty much stayed my home church. And since our church live streamed services before the pandemic, it pretty much stayed, like it never really changed. I did go to Redlands United Methodist a few times, and I did perform there with my aunt, who's a member of that church, but it was really more what is more convenient and do I want to get out of bed on a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. I'm currently studying at the University of Redlands, where I am a double major in education and public policy with a minor in race and ethnic studies. And I'm currently getting my multi-subject credential, and I'm on the pathway to get my master's in learning and teaching. So my dad is a youth director and has been since before I was born, and my mom helped with that as well. So when I was 8, 9, like right before I was about to go into youth group, I was always really jealous that I didn't get to go to youth group because they would go on all these fun trips. Like they would go to the movies and they'd have like lock-ins where everyone got to stay up all night. And as a 8, 9-year-old, that sounds really cool. And I wanted to do it too. And my parents would be gone from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. and we'd stay with my grandparents. So I was like, what are my mom and dad like leaving me for every Sunday? Like they always choose the youth over me on Sunday afternoons. But when I was in middle school, like 11, 12, 13, it wasn't so much of a rebellious phase as I didn't want to go, but there were definitely times where I was like not embarrassed, but I was a little bit embarrassed because my dad's stories during youth group always were like about our family and about me. And I didn't want I was like, oh, don't talk about me because I was amongst my peers. So I didn't want to be the center of attention. I was still kind of a wallflower. And when we would sing like camp songs and all those, I was always like in children's church. That would be super embarrassing to me because I was like, Dad, why are you singing? It's so awkward. But I started to really like going to church when I started going to SSP the summer before my freshman year of high school, because there were suddenly more youth that were my age. So there was Ashley Rios, who is one of my good friends, and we kind of grew up in the church together, but not quite because I went every week and she kind of went as much as she could. And Santiago Reynolds, who his mom also works with our church. And so he would come pretty often, but we were still at the age where it was like boys and girls aren't really friends. And then Trent Heisey, who was the younger brother of one of the older youth who I was really close with, but I'd never spoken to him, so we weren't really close. And then the four of us were in a car together going up to Chiloquin, Oregon. So that was 10 hours of us being in the car together. And that was where we really started to bond and we started to get to know each other as real friends and not just church friends. And I think that's where it started to shift for me, because I wasn't the youth director's daughter anymore. I was just someone's friend. I don't know if there's really a specific moment or time, but it kind of just became one of those things that grew up with me and I guess I was able to articulate it better than I was when I was younger. And I think that came with finding my voice and really being able to speak about my personal life without being like, oh my God, this is so awkward. So I don't really know when it kind of became a thing. I guess when I was finally put into the position of having to talk about it, I guess that it was just always there and it was waiting to come out.
At the Church of the Good Shepherd, we know there are no stupid questions, and that they should be asked and answered for no other reason than to satiate the desire for knowledge. Our answers will be different. They may not be what we want to hear or what we expect. The woman at the well looked to Jesus asking for a simple drink of water. But instead, she received advice that would, unbeknownst to her, become a crucial advice for all of us. We don't have all the answers, which is why we should ask every question that comes to mind. And if we asked several different people, we should expect that each one would respond with something different, because every person has created their own set of values and beliefs. From this point on, do not be afraid to ask questions. Answer the inquiries of those around you, especially the children, because they are in the process of creating their own faith, and they will need guidance to do so.
On one hand, I don't think that it is like glaringly obvious that this was a school with a religious affiliation. And I know a lot of my friends don't have like a specific religious affiliation. They weren't really raised in the church, and they don't feel that like pressure that this is a church school, you know, you have to take a religious studies class or you have to go to mass. But it's definitely there. We have a really great chaplain emeritus. His name is John Walsh, and he's always very present, not only as one of the confidants on campus, but also in just sharing like sharing prayers or sharing time to study. And he teaches religious studies as well, and always is willing to have that conversation about how is the church really moving forward and developing. And something I can definitely pinpoint is whenever we are struck with tragedy, he's always one of the first people to welcome not only people who are of faith, but people who aren't of faith to gather in this area we have called the Labyrinth, which is right outside of our memorial chapel. And it's this very pensive area of self-reflection to just gather and be together, and not necessarily have a worship service, but to have that community support physically and also emotionally. I think one thing that's definitely happened that I can tell from the youth perspective is that youth group or youth choir or bell choir used to be your extracurricular. That was the one activity that you did that would go on your college application, and that was signifying really who you were. And at least when I was going through high school, you did not just do one activity, you did 6 or 7. And I was a part of a lot of clubs at my high school, and I was taking private cello lessons, and I was involved at the church. So I think time really became an issue because everyone is competing to have these resumes with a laundry list of extracurriculars. But I also think it's because a lot more of my generation is becoming more spiritual than religious. So what that means to me is they're believing that whatever they want to, celebrate and to acknowledge, that's not in a structured classic church style. It's, in the garden at my university or in that labyrinth. And it's these more self-reflective, independent times rather than the Sunday morning at 10 a.m. scheduled, worship time. I only did 1 year when we went to Saley in Arizona, that was in the Navajo Nation. And we had the opportunity to speak with tribal elders and to meet some of the members of the community. And they brought jewelry and they brought food. So we were able to get that cultural exposure. But a lot of my SSP experience has been in the urban sites. So we did San Diego and Chiloquin, and we did Smith River. So those are more of the urban sites. We were still being exposed to different denominations of Christianity. And I can think of 1 year where we had a group that was from Texas, and they were very different just socially from us in Southern California. And the way they did things, like when they'd say like, ma'am, or like the way that they would go about prayer, it was so different from anything that I've ever experienced. So I think I was still pushed out of my comfort zone in that way, even though it didn't have that really distinct cultural split. For the first, for kindergarten through sixth grade, I actually didn't go to school in Arcadia. I went to the private school that my parents worked at. That was in Pasadena. It was an Episcopal school. We had the plaid skirts and the sweater vests, but it was a predominantly white institution. And I definitely remember being one of maybe less than 20 people on campus who were AAPI. And, you know, three of those people were my family members. It was my sister and my mom and my dad. So it was definitely interesting to grow up not being surrounded by a lot of Asian culture, just because my classmates weren't, my classmates were predominantly white. And then I had a few African American classmates and a few Hispanic Latinx classmates. So I don't think that I really felt in touch with my Asian culture until I moved to the Arcadia Unified School District, which is 70% Asian. And that is predominantly East Asians because it's a very affluent community. And I think it is really easy to kind of label the San Gabriel Valley as this monolith because of the high concentration of Korean, Japanese, and Chinese immigrants and first generation immigrants. But it really introduced me to a lot of the cultural differences between Asian parents and white parents, because I'd always felt like I wasn't really white because I was Asian and I ate rice with chopsticks, and I, you know, had a grandparents who didn't speak English. But then when I got to Arcadia, I was the whitest person there because I didn't, you know, understand their language. I didn't really eat their foods, and just the cultural differences between how you're raised were really different to me, because suddenly everyone knew exactly what I was talking about when my dad would say, like, you can't go play outside until you practice your cello. And none of my friends' parents were like that. They could go outside and play whenever they wanted. And then moving to Redlands, I definitely felt less of the culture shock of not being in that Arcadia bubble than a lot of my friends did, because I had already been to that, you know, predominantly non-Asian institution. So it was like I was reverting back to my elementary school days, and I knew, like, oh, they don't eat a lot of Chinese food here, but I know that, and I know how to not assimilate, but how to function in that kind of non-Asian space. And a lot of my friends were going now to a lot of predominantly white institutions, and they had only ever been to Arcadia. So they'd never had the exposure to being the minority until they had gotten to college. And I know that it was something they really struggled with. And in a way, I was glad that I wasn't as jarred by that change in experience. But on the other hand, I have been very lucky in my experience in Redlands, because I know a lot of my AAPI friends have had, you know, microaggressions and have felt out of place because they were Asian. But I've been very fortunate to not have those experiences, and I haven't, you know, felt excluded or treated differently in any way because of my race. So microaggressions are kind of these little digs or assumptions that someone can make to you about your race that aren't overtly racist, but are still, you know, digging at that cultural difference. So for someone who is East Asian like me, it might be that, you know, like, oh, you're really good at math, right? And I am not very good at math. Or I'm half Chinese, half Filipino. So when people see my last name, they automatically assume that I'm Chinese. And then when I say, oh, I'm like half Chinese, half Filipino, they say, oh, you don't look Filipino. It's like, well, what does a Filipino person look like? Something that we've talked a lot about in the race and ethnic studies courses that I've been taking is this idea of being colorblind versus color conscious. So being colorblind would be something that's been circulated pretty frequently in the last 20 years or so. And it's not noticing what race someone is or not noticing what gender or sexual orientation someone is because you are just seeing them as a person. And that's great. But when you are color conscious, you are recognizing that there is a difference, whether that be socially or economically or in just how they were raised and the fundamental standards of their upbringing, and recognizing that there is a difference. And because of that difference, they're going to have a different experience. So looking at the experience of someone who is Chinese and recognizing how that's going to be different from someone who is Burmese, who has darker skin, um, who really doesn't get to be, uh, who is negatively impacted by this monolith, because when you look at the economic breakdown of the San Gabriel Valley, you're going to see that Asians as a whole category are doing very well, because you have these pocketed communities like Arcadia and San Marino, where the houses are worth millions of dollars and the everyone is driving a BMW or a Tesla, and there's a lot of privilege in those spaces. But if you were to break it down and see how many of those people are East Asians and how many of those people are Central Asians or Southeast Asians who are Indian, Burmese, Vietnamese, Singaporean, and how they are not doing very well and they're really suffering because there is such a high regard for East Asians. Because when you just check Asian, you're not considering the differences even just between those racial groups. That comes up a lot actually in my education courses, because we're discussing what can you do to bring every student up to where they need to be, because a lot of students will come ready with their reading and writing skills and they will be literate, and you're going to have students who aren't, and you cannot devote the same amount of time to students who can't yet read and write as the students who can read and write, because the students who need to be brought up to that third grade or fifth grade level, they're going to need that extra time. And that doesn't mean anything is bad about those students. And that's why the teacher is spending more or less time with them. It's that that's what they need to be brought up to the level where they deserve to be, that they have otherwise not been able to get because of this, equity versus equality thing. One of the organizations that I've been able to work with at the University of Redlands is this program called REACH. And it's a partnership with San Bernardino Juvenile Hall that allows students to go into juvenile hall and work with incarcerated students, either through tutoring or through workshopping. So I got the opportunity to do one full semester of an Inside Out class where we were discussing alongside the incarcerated students ways to improve the education system and how they felt that they had been failed by their teachers. And then the spring of 2020, so I didn't get very many chances to go in, but we got to teach a workshop. So on one hand, that's great for me because I'm getting, firsthand teaching experience in front of a classroom of 25 students, and there's no teacher helping me. I'm, along with my group members, are teaching. We had to write a lesson plan, we had to write our learning objectives, so I'm really teaching for real. But we also got to look at the educational standards and content standards and address the fact that a lot of these students aren't being taught the information that they're going to need once they are no longer incarcerated. So we were able to focus our lessons to be surrounding the media and social media and how to create a positive digital footprint and how to use the internet to get a job and looking for jobs and creating that online resume, because that's not anywhere in the content standards. And for the students that I was working with who were on longer term sentences, many of them they didn't have an Instagram, they didn't have a Snapchat, they didn't have a LinkedIn, and they didn't even know what LinkedIn was. So the opportunity to get to introduce that to them and give them just the slightest bit of foundation of where they can start in 5 years and 10 years that is just the bare minimum was really eye-opening, because there's so much that they're not being exposed to, and by the time they're no longer within that system, the world is going to have completely changed. So I was really glad that I got to have that opportunity.
One last thing I want to ask you is you're doing a podcast for the school, is that right?
Yes, I am. We started a podcast for students who are applying to the University of Redlands, just to give them an idea about different areas of life, like how to choose your major and your advisor, or Greek life, or housing and roommates. And that's been a really cool project to kind of get to spearhead. I believe it is going to be on the Redlands website, but if you are interested in going to Redlands or hearing about Redlands, I am a student tour guide. So you can visit our visit page at the University of Redlands and either sign up for a virtual tour with me, or I would be happy just to discuss with you over email or over a Zoom and tell you all about the university and the really amazing opportunities that I've gotten from it.